Well, good morning and welcome everyone to our webinar today. My name is Mark Sergi, and along with my partners Colette, Oliver and Lawrence, we're going to talk you through some topical parts of this very interesting sector. We've all become pretty proficient, I think, in recent times in relation to these kinds of technologies, but if you do need attention, you can press the button there you can see on the screen to the right. And if you've got questions to ask, we will deal with these at the end. If you could type them into the box, they'll be collected and we can answer them for you. What we're going to look at then is the general condition of the sector prior to the COVID-19 crisis. We'll then cover what's new and what might be able to help you at the moment. We've got some interest from the CMA in the sector and we'll be talking through that. And then we'll summarise for you at the end and then move into questions. So construction sector distress, I'm going to hand over now to Colette.
Thank you, Mark. Good morning, everybody. So let's first look at problems before COVID-19 in the construction sector. So what we were seeing then is cash flow issues and a type of domino effect where you might have bad debts. So your business might have debts that it's tried to recover and not being able to recover. And then you can have a domino effect where then it affects your ability to pay the supply chain in time or at all. We were also seeing claims from clients over historic contracts or projects that hadn't gone so well. There was also a race to the bottom on pricing, which was a major issue of low margins. And there was an adequate order book and pipeline for some businesses, not least because of Brexit uncertainty. There was also an adversarial approach, so a lack of collaboration between contracting parties to agree palatable commercial solutions when problems did come along on projects. If we look next at some statistics which show us that actually, unlike some of the sectors that now might be suffering distress for the first time because of COVID-19, the construction sector has been feeling that pain for some time. If we look at this slide, we see the Building Magazine on the 14th of February 2020 reported the worst performing sectors in 2019, and unfortunately, construction was quite high up. We see when we look at administration, liquidation, and company voluntary arrangements, construction for administration took the second position, 15.7% of the proportion of the total administrations. It was the same for liquidation, again, second position, 13.8%. And then when we look at company voluntary arrangements, we see that construction was in the first position, 16.3% of the proportion of the total. Let's look at some statistics and predictions on how COVID-19 is likely to affect the economy globally and in the UK. The International Monetary Fund issued its worst global outlook since the Great Depression, predicting shrinkage in the economies of a minimum of 170 countries. If we look at the predictions for the UK, we see that we're expecting economic shrinkage of 14% in the next year, and that's the fastest fall on record. Government borrowing due to lockdown and the COVID-19 impact is also higher than ever seen before. 298.4 billion is predicted for the year, mostly by the autumn. That equates to 15th of the value of the entire economy and is the highest level in peacetime history. It's also a figure that is almost 6 times greater than the March 2020 budget prediction, which was 54.8 billion. Let's look at some problems since COVID-19. So I've given you a list of the issues that we were seeing before COVID-19. Unfortunately, none of that has gone away. The problems have actually just been increased, and some particular issues specific to COVID-19 have also come along. Site safety is a key issue. Many of us have spent a lot of time talking to clients about Construction Leadership Council safe operating procedures, and also more recently, since the 11th of May, the government guidance for construction and other outdoor work. We've spoken to many clients about contractual claims and the issue of force majeure. We can see from discussions with our clients that there's been plenty of news in the media as well, shortage of materials due to disrupted production. There's been an increased competition for available opportunities. That's a little bit of an issue now, but we expect that that's only going to get worse as time goes on. Decreased workload due to reduced demand and confidence. Disruption of the supply chain where demand is outstripping supply. So we have a fragile supply chain. That's a major risk, with 70 or 80% of the construction materials being UK sourced. There's a real risk as well of a loss of industry capacity if supplies do collapse. Potential insurance coverage issues are something that we speak to clients about too, and the need to check that you are covered to be on site during the COVID-19 outbreak. There's also a risk of widespread consolidations and collapses. We saw the slide from the Building magazine, which showed as many collapses last year. We've started to see more of those this year too in the construction sector. What is new and how it might help your business? Let's look at some of the lifelines that are actually out there. We've got government rescue schemes. There are a number of these. And if anybody wants advice in relation to those, whether it be the application process, eligibility criteria, and advice on the terms of the various schemes, then by all means contact our Patricia Grenier, who's a partner in our banking and finance team. First, let's look at this job retention scheme. It's costing the government about 100 billion, 14 billion per month. It's protecting over 7.5 million workers and 1 million businesses. It's a grant that is direct to employers. It was extended on the 12th of May from the end of June to the end of October this year. But there are going to be some changes to the scheme from August to October. Employers will pay a percentage towards the salaries of furloughed staff, so substituting the government contribution of 80% of salary up to £2,500 a month per person. And there'll be an option of part-time furlough. We've got the business interruption loan scheme. This is for small to medium-sized businesses with a turnover of up to 41 million. It's loans of 10,000 to 5 million, and there's no personal guarantee on loans to 250,000, but the borrower obviously will remain liable 100% for the debt. Before I talk about the COVID-19 corporate financing facility, I just want to mention briefly another rescue scheme where applications started only yesterday, 20th May. That's the Future Fund. It's a scheme that will issue convertible loans between 125,000 to 5 million to innovative companies which are facing financing difficulties due to COVID-19. The government's made £250 million available for the Future Fund. As I say, applications opened yesterday, 20th May, and it's the investor that makes the application on behalf of an eligible company. The key criteria is the need to prove that it's a business that has raised at least £250,000 in equity investment from third-party investors in the last 5 years. And the Future Fund will match up to 100% of the sum provided by the investors up to that maximum of 5 million that I mentioned. Okay, COVID-19 corporate financing facility is the next scheme. This is for larger businesses, so larger than the business interruption loan scheme has in mind, and the minimum loan is 1 million. Businesses making material contribution to the UK economy can benefit from this. So it might be a UK headquarters and an overseas parent company, for example. Unsecured short-term debt instruments of up to 1 year maturity. And there must be credit rating evidence of sound financial health prior to the COVID-19 outbreak. We've got the Bounce Back Loan Scheme. This is a fast-track loan scheme for small to medium-sized businesses, 100% government-backed for lenders. Government pays the interest for the first year. This is a vital cash injection for those small businesses, borrowing £2,000 to £50,000 and they can access that cash within 10 days of submission of the short standardised online application. No repayments will be due during the first 12 months. Procurement Policy Note number 2 of 2020 is COVID-related hardship supplier relief for public projects. This is where suppliers' ability to meet contractual obligations have been adversely affected due to COVID-19. It's not mandatory, but the public bodies are trying to help the supply chain in order to ensure service continuity and maintain cash flow. The government has introduced a model interim payment terms, which propose forward ordering, payments in advance, interim payments, and payment on order. It's really important to mention that there is an industry call for similar supplier relief schemes on private sector projects. Next, I'm going to hand over to Oliver Nelson, who's going to speak to you about insolvency issues.
Thank you, Colette. My name's Oliver Nelson, and I'm a partner in our insolvency and restructuring team. I'm going to talk about some areas of insolvency law which are subject to some recent developments, or which I think are particularly relevant at the current time. So the first of these relates to wrongful trading and the implications for personal liability for directors. On the 28th of March, the government announced a temporary suspension retrospectively from the 1st of March for 3 months of the wrongful trading provisions. And the release in support of that said that this was to give company directors greater confidence to use their best endeavours to continue to trade during the pandemic emergency without the threat of personal liability should the company ultimately fall into insolvency. We'll say that legislation would be introduced at the earliest opportunity. Well, it took nearly 8 weeks, and in fact, yesterday afternoon, the Corporate Insolvency and Governance Bill was published. That will, of course, need to go through the various stages of Parliament, and I suggest that it probably won't become law until the end of June or the beginning of July. But the terms of that do reflect the announcement on the suspension of the wrongful trading provisions, and they will apply from the 1st of March up to the 30th of June, or 1 month after the new act comes into force. So a little bit more about wrongful trading. What is it exactly? Well, it applies in liquidations and administrations. In other words, liquidators and administrators can, in the course of their administration, take proceedings against directors personally. And it applies where at some point before the commencement of the winding up, a person who was a director knew or ought to have concluded that there was no reasonable prospect that the company would avoid going into insolvent liquidation. Now, it's important to note that these wrongful trading provisions apply to all types of directors, and that includes directors or people that act or carry out the functions of a director without actually being formally appointed as such. And the test of what a director knew or ought to have concluded includes a general knowledge, skill and expertise that may be expected of a person carrying out the same functions as are carried out by that particular director, but also the same skills that that person actually has. So it's important to note that where, for instance, a finance director with accountancy qualifications, and we're looking at his conduct, he's expected to exercise a higher level of skill than would be expected of an unqualified person. There is a general defence available to wrongful trading, that the director took every step with a view to minimising the potential loss to the company's creditors that he ought to have taken. Now, my problem with the the suspension of these provisions is that they only actually apply to wrongful trading and don't affect the duties of directors generally, or other provisions such as directors' disqualification. And so, looking briefly at directors' duties generally, it's worth noting that where a company is solvent, a director owes duties to the company and its shareholders. That's under the Companies Act. But where a company is insolvent or is likely to be unable to avoid insolvency, a director's duty to promote the interests of the company changes. So his duty is then to act in the interest of the company's creditors. And liquidators can make claims against directors for breach of duty, and it's generally under Section 212 of the Insolvency Act. But the problem is that if a director is in breach of Section 214, i.e. the wrongful trading provisions, he may well also be in breach of his general duties to creditors. Now, it remains to be seen how in due course this is interpreted by the courts, and it might be that directors argue that they've been encouraged to continue trading by the suspension of the wrongful trading provisions, and that trading through the crisis was intended to be in the interests of creditors. But my own view is that if a company is in a position where there's no reasonable prospect of avoiding liquidation, it really would be dangerous to rely on the suspension provisions, as in fact the protection they confer may be limited. It is worth just noting there is a general defence to breach of directors' duties where the court considers that the director acted honestly and reasonably, and in the circumstances ought fairly to be excused. So some general points as regards reducing the risk of personal claims against directors for wrongful trading and breach of directors' duties generally. It's worth noting that resigning as a director does not exonerate a director from acts carried out prior to resignation. It's particularly important to maintain accurate and up-to-date financial records and to monitor the company's financial position and cash flow, and of course to hold regular board meetings. Probably the most important of these points is the next one, i.e. to take and keep detailed minutes of the board meetings and note the decisions made, and importantly the reasons for them. That then can provide the evidence which might be required months or years down the line to demonstrate to the liquidator or others the reasons why certain decisions were made. Also vital, of course, that final point, for companies to take professional advice from insolvency lawyers or an insolvency practitioner, because if professional advice is taken and acted on, then that does confer substantial protection for directors in relation to actions taken thereafter. Moving on to a slightly different topic, that of preferences. Where a company has financial problems, of course, it always needs to decide which creditors to pay, and that can cause difficulties. A preference is where a payment is made to a creditor, which has the effect of putting that creditor in a better position than they otherwise would have been if the company enters liquidation or administration. A preferential payment is open to challenge if made within 6 months of the commencement of the winding up, or 2 years prior to that if the creditor is connected, for instance, if the payment is made to a director of the company or a group company. A liquidator or administrator can make a preferential claim for a preference where he can show that the company was insolvent and influenced by a desire to give that preference at the time of making the payment. So the claim would be made against the recipient of the payment or transaction normally, but it's also worth bearing in mind that it does expose directors to a potential personal liability for allowing that transaction to take place. And again, that would be potentially a breach of director's duty. So business critical payments and those made to avoid enforcement actions, such as a winding up petition, are unlikely to be preferences, but care needs to be taken generally in this respect. Just moving on to the next slide, I thought I'd mention something about light touch administrations, as you may have heard this expression used recently in the press. And in fact, this procedure was used in the Debenhams administration. Now, it's not a new procedure, but what is new is that a consent protocol has been drawn up, and this allows administrators to basically delegate the powers to run the business to the existing directors. Now, administrators are not supposed to use this procedure unless they're satisfied that the company can be rescued as a going concern and that it has sufficient working capital to pay the post-administration costs. But the aim of this is to protect the business during the lockdown, allowing it to return to solvency when there's a return to normality. The advantage of it is that the company enjoys the usual protection from creditors' actions, in other words, the moratorium. And the idea is that it lowers the administration costs, although I have to say that generally a fairly high level of supervision will be required by the administrators. I think generally it's unlikely to be used regularly because of the high risk for administrators and because sufficient funding is needed to pay suppliers and other expenses during the administration period. So I think the procedure may be suitable for some construction companies, but it's still going to be an expensive route. And in many cases where there's financial distress, reaching informal arrangements with creditors where possible will be a more satisfactory way forward. Moving on to the next topic, void transactions after winding up petitions. I thought I'd just mention this because although effectively there are restrictions on issuing petitions at the moment, and they're down about 80% currently, I think that when we do move out of lockdown and the restrictions come to an end, we may well see an increase of the use of winding up petitions. So Section 127 of the Insolvency Act provides that dispositions made by a company after presentation of the winding up petition, and this only applies where a winding up order is ultimately made, those dispositions are void if not sanctioned by the court. Now, the liquidator can, under these provisions, reclaim payments from the recipients. And the general rule is that dispositions occurring after the commencement of the winding up will only be validated by court if they were of benefit to the general body of unsecured creditors. So this can be pretty harsh for recipients or creditors in these circumstances, but the intention behind the provisions is to ensure that creditors are treated equally in the event that the company does go into liquidation. Moving on then to some proposals for some new procedures. In March, again, the government said that it was going to introduce what it described as a flexible restructuring plan. We do now have some more details of this in the bill that was published yesterday. And basically, this is a procedure that requires court approval. And the intention is to allow companies to restructure in a way that avoids formal insolvency, and where creditors or classes of creditors or shareholders vote on a plan where 75% in value of those voting have to approve. My feeling at the moment, and we only got some further detail of these proposals late yesterday, my feeling is that this is unlikely to be suitable for smaller companies and only really the preserve of larger companies due to the costs involved. Moving on to the some further proposals for a new moratorium. This is another new procedure that will be available to companies and insolvency practitioners. Details again are contained in the bill that was published yesterday. I suspect that a great deal of use will be made of these new provisions once they come into force, as I say, probably beginning of July onwards. The intention is that they'll be used in a situation to give a company a breathing space to bring about a rescue or restructure of the company. I suspect this procedure may well be used to bring about or propose a voluntary arrangement. The directors can avail themselves of the new moratorium by filing certain documents at court, or where there's a winding up petition outstanding, it needs to be an actual application to court. And that needs to be supported by a statement from a person that's described as the monitor, and that has to be an insolvency practitioner, that a moratorium would likely result in the rescue of the company as a going concern. So the moratorium initially would apply for 20 business days, so it's described in the bill, rather than 28 days, as I've stated in the notes, and can be extended thereafter for a further 20 days, business days, or longer with the creditors or the court approval. Now, the proposal suggested that this new procedure wouldn't be available for insolvent companies. I'm pleased to say that's not the case, having looked at the bill, and this will apply to solvent and insolvent companies which have a prospect of being rescued and are able to meet their financial obligations during the moratorium. So there are provisions in there that the company must meet debts as they arise during the moratorium period. So moving on now to a slightly different topic, taking remuneration. I think in the current climate, care needs to be taken here as to how directors and shareholders take money out of the company. We need to bear in mind, of course, that dividends are only permitted where there are distributable profits, and therefore if money is taken out and it turns out that there was no distributable profit during the period, that's money that could be reclaimed by a liquidator or administrator. Also beware of making loans to directors, or indeed repaying loans from directors, as again those could be reclaimed by a liquidator or administrator. So in general terms, it's often better in times of distress to take remuneration out of the company in the form of salary. So finally, just some general observations. I think more than ever at the current time, it's critical to review cash and funding, to analyse what income will continue to come in, what options there are for new income streams. As Colette said, what government support is available and what efficiencies and cost savings can be made. Also vital to monitor and keep on top of and communicate with your debtors, and to communicate with all the stakeholders, including lenders, landlords, finance companies and other key suppliers, and of course, where necessary, to negotiate with creditors. So I will now pass on to Lawrence.
Hello, good morning. I'm Lawrence Fitzgerald. I'm a competition partner at Waitmans. I'm here to give an overview of some of the activities of the competition authorities in relation to the construction sector. During the COVID-19 crisis, competition laws for the main part remain in force, You may have read that there have been some very limited relaxations in competition laws in very limited sectors. These allow for limited collaboration between competitors in the provision of healthcare services, the distribution of food and groceries, and dairy farming during the current crisis we're in. But with the monies being spent by the public sector on infrastructure projects, the regulator, the Competition and Markets Authority, is keen to enforce the laws to ensure that the public sector does not fall victim to price fixing or bid rigging or other anti-competitive arrangements. But the prohibition of anti-competitive agreements remains in force. Typical offences: price fixing, market sharing, bid rigging, and the fines which can be imposed are very large, up to 10% of group worldwide turnover. So that's turnover, not profit. There's also action being taken not just against the businesses involved, but also against the individuals who are involved in the anti-competitive arrangements. So individuals, it's a criminal offence, the cartel criminal offence for individuals and businesses to set up or implement anti-competitive agreements with competitors. There's no need to prove dishonesty. When this law first came in, you had to prove that the individual had acted dishonestly. But what was found that juries would not convict individuals because they couldn't get their heads around the dishonesty aspect. And the people would say, I didn't know what I did was wrong, or I did it to save jobs. So that requirement is now removed. There's no need to prove dishonesty. And this has resulted in a ramping up of activity against individuals. So they don't need to be directors or even senior employees. Anybody in the business involved in setting up or implementing anti-competitive agreements with their competitors is guilty of the cartel offence, and they can be fined for imprisoned, limited fine, and if they are directors, disqualified for being directors for up to 15 years. CMA operates a leniency program. Cartels, by their very nature, are secretive, and there's a program to encourage whistleblowing. The first person to blow the whistle on the cartel will receive up to 100% reduction in fines. The construction industry remains in the sights of the CMA. It launched in February 2020 a campaign known as the Cheating or Competing campaign. It's not specifically aimed at the construction industry, but when it launched, the Competition and Markets Authority noted that a number of its recent cases have come from the construction industry. It carried out a survey of some 400 UK senior representatives from the construction sector, which revealed that familiarity with competition laws was low. And now I think we're going to watch a price fixing video.
Price fixing. When two or more businesses collude to decide what prices they're going to charge, this is known as price fixing. It puts less pressure on them to keep their prices down, which cheats their customers, who end up paying over the odds. Businesses that agree to fix their prices deprive customers from getting a fair deal, and their victims will often be other businesses as well as consumers. If you see any activity that you think is price fixing, you should report it. And if you're involved, you may be able to avoid fines, prison sentences, and damage to your reputation by applying for leniency. Call the Business Cartels Hotline using the number on screen.
Price fixing is an idea. What that is, there's really agreements which you reach with your competitors about maximum, minimum target prices, price ranges. An example is we both agree that we will not supply this product or service below a certain price. Another major piece of competition law is market sharing. So here's another big video which the CMA has issued.
Market sharing. When businesses collude to carve up markets and agree not to go after the same customers, this is known as market sharing. A market could be the sale of a specific product, a particular type of customer, or a geographical area. For example, two businesses might agree that one will sell to customers in the West, while another will sell to customers in the East. Businesses may agree to carve up a market, so they face less pressure to compete with each other. This can result in less choice, and you as a customer may end up paying more than you should. Victims of market sharing will often be other businesses as well as consumers. If you see any activity that you think is market sharing, you should report it. And if you're involved, you may be able to avoid fines, prison sentences, and damage to your reputation by applying for leniency. Call the Business Cartels Hotline using the number on screen.
Basically, typical market sharing is with regard to, say, territories. You stay out of England, you stay out of Wales or North or South England. We agree to share customers, or we agree not to supply a particular customer, or we agree to boycott a particular supplier. And finally, bid rigging. So there's another brief video about that.
Bid rigging. Bid rigging is when bidders create the illusion of competition while secretly agreeing which one of them will win a tender. This drives up prices and leaves the clients paying over the odds. For example, 3 bidders collude and agree that one will bid £1 million, another 1.2 million, and a third 1.4 million. The job goes to the bidder with what looks to be the lowest bid at £1 million, but the competition was an illusion. The price could have been lower if they were genuinely competing to win the business. While any business can be a victim of bid rigging, it can also waste taxpayers' money by driving up the price of contracts for schools, hospitals, and other public services. If you see any activity that you think is bid rigging, you should report it. And if you're involved, you may be able to avoid fines, prison sentences, and damage to your reputation by applying for leniency. Call the Business Cartels Hotline using the number on screen.
Yeah, 3 types of bid rigging: a sort of cover bidding where you agree with someone else that you will put your you will agree a price with someone else, so that then when the bid bid suppression, where you agree to abstain from bidding or to withdraw a bid, or bid rotation, where a pre-selected supplier submits the lowest bid on a systematic or rotating basis. It may well be that sometimes you see subcontracting arrangements being entered into. It's also a breach of competition law to disclose confidential information to your competitors or prospective competitors. So you give there some information as to what those types of arrangements could be, so prices, etc. The authorities have issued guidances on breach of competition law, stuff issued by the OFT. I think they give 10 examples of suspicious activities to look out for with regard to bid rigging. I won't go through those, but they're on the screens. So something that these are aimed at the public sector, what the public sector should be looking for, and the CMA from time to time issues guidances to the public sector on what to look out for bid rigging. Okay, so directors have a special responsibility to lead by example, to be clear on competition law rules and promote a culture of compliance in the business they lead. Director or senior manager level involvement in the cartel can result in the company paying higher fines, and directors can also be fined, imprisoned and disqualified, as we've seen. And the CMA actively considers director disqualification orders in every cartel it investigates. So now we look at some case studies. So the first we'll be looking at is a truck cartel case, which we're involved in, and I'll ask Mark to take up on that one.
Yes, thanks, Lawrence. This is a very interesting case for everybody, but particularly for Watemans, because we are involved in an application to launch a collective proceedings order in respect of this particular cartel. For those of you that haven't heard about it, and it is quite high profile, this was a cartel that lasted for 14 years, going back as far as 1997, and affected the medium to heavyweight trucks market. And there were long investigations here and in the European Union. And in 2016, the European Union issued a formal finding that the cartel had indeed taken place, and it issued record fines to the cartelists who were involved. Once a regulatory decision has been pronounced, that opens up the possibility of damages claims, what competition lawyers call follow-on damages claims. That is, claims for compensation following on from a finding by the regulator that a cartel has indeed been uncovered. In the trucks cartel, the amount of the loss is estimated to be in the region of 14 billion, which is a huge sum of money. And it's pretty impossible for individual truck operators who've lost relatively small amounts of money to find the means by which they can bring proceedings on their own against those who are responsible. And they may well very well face much larger opponents and not have the money to be able to manage the claim. So in 2015, for the first time in English law, a class action regime was introduced whereby a representative body or a representative individual can stand in the shoes of everybody in the marketplace who's been affected by the cartel and to seek an award of what's called aggregated damages. So instead of every individual operator, in this case in the trucks market, for example, that's lost money by paying more for a truck than it should have done, claiming his individual loss, it's possible for the representative to seek a lump sum payment against those who were responsible, which can then be distributed on a basis that's a fair basis to everybody who forms part of the class of individuals or businesses that suffered the loss. These types of schemes are put together whereby the legal costs are provided for the victims, and any risk of having to pay the costs to the opponent if the case, for example, fails or otherwise has some difficulty, are covered by insurance, and the legal fees are provided by funders. And going back to the point that Lawrence made earlier about incentivizing whistleblowers, it is true that if you come forward as a whistleblower under the leniency scheme, you become immune from paying fines, but it's not the case in relation to damages for the most part. So if a cartelist has blown the whistle, that cartelist can still be exposed to having to pay compensation, and possibly under the class action regime. Lawrence, do you want to do the drainage cartel?
Yes, so this is a recent decision relating to concrete drainage products used in the construction industry. So this is the cartelists represented 90% of the market. They had secret meetings in hotel rooms, 4 of which were secretly recorded by the CMA. So they got wind, the fact there was a whistleblower here, they got wind of that this is going on, and they had powers to carry out surveillance. So they recorded the meetings. Basically, the cartelists agreed to fix prices, share markets, exchange competitively sensitive information, and they were fined £60 million. And the CMA, in its press release when it announced its decision, said that the construction sector remains in its sights, and tough market conditions are no excuse for breaking the law. Not only were the businesses themselves fined, but also directors have been have proceedings brought against them. One director was arrested and charged, pleaded guilty to the cartel offence and sentenced to 2 years suspended imprisonment. Disqualified for being a company director for 7 years. So these are what the CMA has described as life-changing sanctions, career-changing sanctions anyway. Another case to do with road lead. This is an ongoing investigation by the CMA. It hasn't been finalised yet. This involves rolled lead, which is used in roofing, mainly for historic buildings, churches, cathedrals, stately homes. So the CMA has issued its preliminary decision against the three largest suppliers that they colluded on prices and exchanged commercially sensitive information, refrained from targeting each other's customers, and collectively refused to supply another company whose business threatened to disrupt the market sharing arrangement. The decision on that, final decision on that, is expected in June. Another case study from a few years ago to do with roofing work. So this is South Tyneside Council invited bids for roofing work for schools, and one of the bidders didn't want to win the contract but didn't want to exclude itself from future bids, so it requested pricing information from a competitor, which was provided to it, and then used that information to submit a false and inflated bid. There was an investigation, and they were both found guilty of breach of competition law through illegal bid rigging. So, lessons to be learned from these: they have sophisticated means of capturing evidence. They may be watching, as I mentioned in the drainage products cartel investigation, they use surveillance equipment. There's a leniency program to encourage whistleblowers. Mark mentioned the truck cartel case. The fines imposed there were a total of 2.9 billion euros. The whistleblower, which was the truck manufacturer MAN, it was fined nil. It blew the whistle. So other fines, 2.9 billion nil for MAN. And the concrete drainage one, £31 million fine on one of the cartels was reduced to 7 million for early cooperation. So basically, check your business practices and ensure that you are complying with competition law. So I think it's Colette for takeaway messages, is it?
Yes, that's right. Thank you, Lawrence. So if we just look at the final slide we've got here, just some general points which round up the issues that we've actually covered between us this morning. The combination or cumulative effect of Brexit, COVID-19 and the economic crisis which is now predicted will test the mettle of the entire construction sector. There really is now a need to explore all options for your business, legal, commercial and financial. It's vital to engage with your stakeholders and supply chain now to find commercial and contractual solutions to COVID-19 project issues. We looked at Procurement Policy Note 2 2020 and said that the type of system needed is also required in the private sector in order to ensure service continuity and cash flow in the supply chain. The government rescue schemes, we summarised some of those. These are unprecedented in scale and cost because clearly extraordinary times call for extraordinary measures. Tough market conditions are no excuse for breaking the law. It really is essential to prioritise CMA and competition law training. Plan now to respond, recover and build for the future resilience of your business. I'm going to hand back to Mark now, who's just going to see if there are any questions.
Thanks, Colette. We have a couple of questions that we can ask. First of all, Oliver, I think this falls within your province. Wrongful trading. Actually, I've got a couple of thoughts on wrongful trading, but let's do this one first. When it comes to looking at how these claims are assessed in court, how does a judge go about deciding what a director is supposed to pay if he's been responsible for some wrongful trading?
Oh, thanks, Mark. I think it's worth bearing in mind first that a liability for wrongful trading only arises if it's shown that the company is worse off as a result of the continuation of trading, and also that if that director has taken every step with a view to minimising the potential loss to creditors, again, he wouldn't be required to make a contribution to the liquidator. But in terms of how the court would normally assess how much the how much the director's liability is, would be by measuring the increase in the company's net deficiency of assets from the time that the director first realised, or should have done, that there was no reasonable prospect of avoiding liquidation, up to the time when the company actually goes into liquidation. So it's really a case of how much has the loss to the company been in that period from when the director should have known that he couldn't avoid insolvent liquidation up to the time of liquidation. That makes sense?
Yeah, and so if you are successful then in obtaining a payment from a director, that money doesn't go to a specific creditor, does it? It just goes into the pot.
It goes into the pot for the benefit of unsecured creditors, actually.
So if you can get a director to pay, I don't know, 50,000 or 100,000
Yep.
through one of these processes, that doesn't give any particular creditor 50 or 100,000.
No, it doesn't. It doesn't. The compensation award would be paid to the liquidator, and that money would be distributed to the general body of creditors in the usual way. So no particular creditor could claim a greater share of it, even if that creditor has in fact suffered a larger loss than perhaps other creditors during the that period of trading.
Right. And it occurred to me, Oliver, while you were speaking about wrongful trading and the emergency suspension of the rules, in practice, does the spectre of wrongful trading sit on the shoulder of directors, do you think? I mean, is this suspension actually going to make any difference to the way people do manage their businesses, or is it something that nobody really thinks about from day to day?
It's difficult to say. I mean, I think I should say that wrongful trading claims are not brought on a regular basis by liquidators, and one of the problems for liquidators and administrators is actually getting the evidence as to exactly when the directors ought to have reached the conclusion that there was no alternative. So they're not brought that often. So I think this is why I said earlier that I don't think the suspension should give directors too much comfort, because I think the real risk lies more in the area of the general duties of directors to the creditors rather than under the wrongful trading provisions. So to some extent, I think the wrongful trading provisions are a bit of a red herring, and possibly they do risk giving directors perhaps too much confidence that they can continue to trade with impunity.
Yes, I see. That's interesting, Oliver. Thank you very much.
Pleasure.
I've got a question for Lawrence as well, but just before I come to you, Lawrence, just another thought or two from me in relation to the trucks cartel and class actions and collective proceedings. I mentioned when I was doing my section earlier that the class action regime was relatively new. The law came into force in 2015, and of course here we are now in the middle of 2020, and there's yet to be much show for any of these class claims at the minute. Listeners might be interested to know that there was an important case in the Supreme Court earlier this week, a case that was held online in the current environment, which was looking at the whole of the class action regime and trying to make some sense out of the threshold that you have to show to be entitled to bring a class action. But although in that particular case we're involved in bringing the claim on behalf of victims, it is of course possible to be on the other side of the fence and for you to have a class claim brought against you. And the prospects of a £14 billion liability from a massive group of individuals who've all suffered small amounts individually but cumulatively enormous is a terrific liability that would be almost unforeseeable. And it's hardly surprising that those who have been found to have been running cartels have little option but to fight tooth and nail, spending a fortune in legal fees. In the end, of course, it may very well be the case that that compensation does have to be paid, and it's a massive sum of money to even begin thinking about, which may indeed, one supposes, bring the prospect of insolvency to the fore for those that do get involved in cartel behaviour.
Yeah, no, I would certainly make the point also, and it's worth, you know, we talked about the whistleblower and the leniency regime, that you get your fine reduced to zero. So man got its fine reduced to zero, but it doesn't mean that you won't be subject to a compensation or damages claim. So they're facing a damages claim. There's a case involving British Airways and Virgin Atlantic, where they agreed the passenger surcharge on their the pricing element, the passenger surcharge. They each agreed what that would be. Virgin went and blew the whistle on that. BA got fined about £50 million. Virgin got fined nil. But again, both of them, BA and Virgin, are facing claims for damages for that. So something to bear in mind before you go rushing off to the CMA confessing this. It doesn't mean that you won't face a damages claim.
No, that's right. And of course, with being a whistleblower, that in itself is a complex environment, not just for that reason that you've given, Lawrence, but getting confidential advice before deciding whether to blow the whistle at all is extremely important. It's a little bit like in the fraud environment, self-reporting to the Serious Fraud Office. It's something that you don't do until you've thought very hard about it and had very, very good and thorough legal advice. So that question, Lawrence, that I had.
Yeah. So I would also say that you know, it could affect your reputation as well, because if the CMA made a public decision, then it would be read by everybody, and they mean that going forward, you may not be invited to tenders. Very much.
Yeah, absolutely. So that one question, Lawrence, that I promised to put over to you, it's in relation to bid rigging. What do you do if you think that you are the victim of bid rigging?
Well, I think you need to try and get the evidence. The CMA, it did issue about a couple of years ago an online tool which could be used, an algorithm which you fed in all the bids, and then it gave a high ranking one or otherwise of evidence of bid rigging. It actually withdrew that tool only a couple of months ago. I don't know why. Maybe it wasn't working properly. But I think, you know, you need to look at the evidence. And if you do think that you have been victim of it, then get in touch with the CMA. They have a cartels hotline, and raise your concerns with them. Or alternatively, come and speak to us so we can advise on that.
Thank you very much. Well, I think we're probably near our time now. Just to let everybody know that we will share the slides, so please look out for those. Thank you very much indeed for joining us, and you're welcome to contact any of the names on this final slide if you want any more information. Thanks very much and good morning.